Hi investors, it's Nick, and today I'm going to walk you through our cost calculator that we're using in the background. It's very helpful because the calculator means I've got some solid numbers from which I can negotiate with estate agents. So the typical process is that we put out properties of interest. You might say, oh, I like that one, great. Then I'll talk to the agent, and what I'm looking for are motivated sellers, and what I want is a very objective, straightforward conversation with the agent saying, well, here are my numbers, and this is the kind of offer price that we believe is right based on our yield targets, which we believe are reasonable. And so when I have that kind of a conversation with the agent, things generally go an awful lot better versus me going, I like this house, but I only want to offer £20,000 less. And it's like, what they're then going to come back at me and go, well, what's your rationale? Implicitly, that's what they would do. And so I just find that when I talk numbers with them, suddenly there's a bit of respect and we can get to the bottom of whatever the deal is. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you the spreadsheet. Now, firstly I'll just do a very quick explainer on the yield targets and why we chose them. So it turns out that there is a linear correlation between asking rent or yield and price. Now there are outliers and so on, but on the whole you can say that it's a pretty linear correlation. So therefore I was able to map out the relationship between the yield and the price. And I've based this data on postcode district data and also localized data sets that I've pulled together over time. And I've looked at the housing stock in a given area, what they're asking for, the rents they're asking for in a given area, and then put the equation together. The yield target is based on a mixture of perceived risk and perceived risk actually. So in other words, if, for example, you're looking at a house, risk and price, I forgot to say. So, for example, if it's a house that's £80,000, you would expect a much higher yield for a couple of reasons. A, because it's smaller amounts of money because the rent is going to be smaller, but the rent will be greater as a proportion of the price of the property. And also, cheaper houses tend to have more risk. So you must have a risk premium. Banks do it when they lend money. If it's a high risk loan, then they charge more interest to cover the risk of default. Well, it's the same process with buying property. You must have a premium for risk, very simply. And anyway, so you could say that a very high risk property, I'll show you some tables, very high risk, extremely high risk should give you, say, 15%. So in other words, if you imagine your £80,000 property and it's a decent property in a decent area, well then somewhere around the 9% mark is probably about right. But if it's lower cost and higher risk, then maybe you should get more yield out of it to cover the risk of something going wrong. Anyway, going back to this. So in this case, we've got let's imagine it's a 3-bedroom semi-detached house, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And let's say we are confident we can get a rent of, say, 980 out of it. And we think that it's going to cost £18,000 to renovate the property. Then the way the calculation works is it says that based on this yield target, we're prepared to offer £156,000. But for the sake of discussion, let's imagine that you just really love the property and you're prepared to accept a lower yield. Well, okay, then fine, you can offer more. But generally speaking, considering the circumstances we're in and the approach that I take when negotiating, it's better to have a stretch target, start from there, and then kind of work our way back. So in this case, we're saying that the total purchase price might be £190,000 with all the bits and pieces. But there is more, and we're going to talk about the stamp duty, which is a very important variable. And then the next thing to look at is the net yield and the net ROI, the cash ROI. So for say 5%, that's reasonable. And the net yield after all purchase costs at 6 points, it's all okay. So everything kind of comes back to a simple metric, which is cost of property and cost to get it to a rentable standard. And that's a good high level, easy rule of thumb metric to work with. And that's what we do. We use that as our anchor metric. So anyway, this is what sort of cash you'd get out of it. And then we're saying that this property, based on our yield target, is overpriced by £24,000 because it's going to cost us £18,000 to renovate it. I'll make it round numbers so you can, just because it's easier. It's going to be £20,000 to sort it out. And once we've done all that work, then yeah, we reckon that's the number. Now, most times agents just go to me and they go, no, they won't accept it. But I'd say about 30% of the time for target properties, they go, yeah, they might consider it. And then we have a conversation and we go from there. So the next thing is stamp duty and fees. So we've got this far and we know that we're 26 grand apart. Okay, fine. But they're just being hopeful. And what I find constantly is that people try a cheeky number and they see what happens. And if nothing happens, they start sweating. And the problem is that if they start reducing the price, then they're kind of putting themselves in a vulnerable position. So you have this interesting thing where I have to do the phone calls and talk to the agents and do my kind of my rounds, as it were, with my numbers, and then I can quickly get to the truth of the matter and find out what's going on, find out if property is a real contender or not. All right, now the next part of it is that the model is based on the idea that I'm just going to get a page up that the model is based on the idea that markets work in cycles and that there are times when it makes sense to buy in cash and others when it makes sense to buy with finance, and it's just knowing where you are in the property cycle. And the property cycle is quite repetitive, and I'll show you here. This is when the market was bubbling away, and this is the property market going back to 1845, and this is house price and affordability ratios. You can see distinct peaks all the way along, even one in World War One, little mini peak, but the fact was there was a micro peak there. So markets work in cycles and they're actually quite predictable, and it's just a case of looking at everything objectively and then working out what you do when. And in this case, what I'm saying is that at the moment, the market did a big peak. Now it's going through a correction phase. It's likely to decline a bit, and then it's likely to plateau out for some years. That is a pretty consistent theme going back 50, 80 years at least. So the data that I've looked at, when I've looked at the last, the various crashes going back to the 90s, it's the same old story. So markets have cycles, and anyway, so getting back to the thing here. So what history tells us from way back is that that the market is likely to have increased interest rates, but because the economy is fundamentally fairly weak, it's likely interest rates will drop again in order to not completely destroy the economy. So therefore, the strategy is to buy with cash at a discount from motivated sellers and then refinance. So if you refinance, because you're adding value to the property, so let's work out how much value you might add to that property. And I have an auto calculation here, but I'm going to say that typically for a nice house where they're asking 180, but it's a motivated sale and they really have to just get on and move the thing, but it needs renovations, then a property in this market, say in 2 years' time, 2-3 years' time when interest rates drop, that property will probably be worth £195,000. And that's factoring in high levels of inflation, small degree of property price growth over time. And that means that in this case, you would get 71% of your money back, and you'd be paying £45,000 for that house, and your return on investment would be 24%, which is pretty good. So that assumes your rental income and stuff. But if I make it 7%, then the ROI does drop significantly. So it's all about the price of money, basically. But anyway, moving on. There are some other variables here which are very important. So one of them is other costs, etc. Now, the next thing that is really, really important is stamp duty. So if a property can be deemed as uninhabitable, then you don't have to pay residential stamp duty. And in this case, for this property, as non-residential, assuming you're paying £154,000 for the property, then you would pay £80 in stamp duty. But if it's deemed as residential, you pay £8,280. And the way that works is very simple, actually. If a property is deemed as uninhabitable, then HMRC will accept that it's non-residential. Because if it's not habitable, how could it be residential? Because residential, by their definition, is where a place is suitable for living in. And therefore, it's a problem. So here's an example of a property that the clients bought, and it's a perfect candidate for low stamp duty, for non-residential stamp duty application. And if we go into the interior, essentially, it's just not really habitable. It was lived in by somebody, but arguably it's not habitable, and there are some guidelines as to what is habitable or not, and based on those guidelines you can argue that this property is not habitable. So it's things like inadequate electrical safety, inadequate kitchen, mold, damp, stuff like that. So it's those kind of, like here for example, mold. And that would immediately classify it as uninhabitable, and therefore HMRC would have to accept, or would accept, that it's non-residential. I know, crazy as it seems, but it's true. And I know it's true because we've got a client who, we've got a number of clients now who've got, I'm just going to do this, who've had stamp duty refunds that were given to them, because property was deemed uninhabitable. So it was this one. Here's an example one. We've got the refund slip screen grab for reference so that you can see. And this property isn't even that bad. It's a nice enough property. In theory, you could live in it. Needs a bit of work, but in theory, someone could live in that house, couldn't they? So this one got a refund, and therefore, I'm very confident that given circumstance, given the right kind of property, that you wouldn't need to pay much stamp duty at all. So I've built this into the calculator. And the next thing is we've got our fee here. Cheers. But we earn it. We find the property. We do the stamp duty thing. We negotiate, we help with the renovations, we do the whole lot. So that's why we are worth it. Anyway, moving on. And then we have various other calculations here. So that's roughly how that works. And as I've said, it's very helpful for working out what's going on with the property deal. And you can see here, the numbers just drop. So down to £8,000 in fees versus 16, just because you bought the right kind of house. Small detail, significant. All right, and there it is. So I hope that's helpful, and thank you very much.